The call for help, 5 to 7 minute hook. The stars in the galaxy shine brightly, but the peaceful world of the XL Theory was in chaos. The XL Theory had been a proud, peaceful species, living in harmony with nature for centuries. Their cities, built on floating islands, were marvels of advanced technology. They had never known fear, for they had mastered every challenge their world could throw at them. But now, everything was different. It all started with a sudden warning from the ancient sentinels on the outer rim of their system. For weeks, the sentinels had been detecting strange, violent patterns from the farthest reaches of space, unnatural movements, like ripples through the fabric of reality. These signs were not of nature, but of something far worse, an enemy, a conqueror, a force that had set its sights on the XL Theory homeworld. The XL Theory Council, composed of the wisest leaders, gathered in their Grand Council Hall. Panic spread among the members as the invaders' fleet was confirmed. The enemy, called the Sharks, was an ancient race known for destroying entire civilizations without mercy. Their ships were massive, capable of crushing anything in their path. The XL Theory had never faced such a threat. They had advanced technology, but the Sharks were unstoppable. Despite the fear building inside the council, that XL Theory had never been a species to give up easily. They quickly tried to assemble a defense force. They activated the planetary shields, locked down cities, and deployed their best warriors. However, no matter how much they prepared, they knew it wasn't enough. The Sharks had conquered worlds for centuries. The XL Theory had no real chance of surviving this attack. Desperation settled in. The council's leader, Nari, stood at the center of the hall, her face grave as she looked at her people. "We need help," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We need help from beyond our world. We need help from those who know how to fight wars." The room fell silent. No one had said the words out loud, but everyone knew what she meant. There were legends among the XL Theory, stories about a race of beings who lived on the most dangerous planets in the universe. These beings were called the Deathworlders, and they were said to be the most fearsome warriors in all of space. They were rumored to survive in environments so deadly that no other life form could even hope to exist there. For years, the XL Theory had dismissed the Deathworlders as myths. The stories were filled with terror, of warriors who fought with a savage brutality that left entire species trembling. But now, in their darkest hour, the XL Theory had no choice but to seek them out. They had nothing left to lose. Nari stood in front of the ancient communication console, her hands trembling slightly. She reached for the activation button and sent a signal, one that had not been used in generations. It was a call for help, a desperate plea from a species on the brink of extinction. The signal would travel across the stars, past the asteroid fields and nebulae, into the dark corners of space where the Deathworlders were said to dwell. The XL Theory knew the legends spoke of how the Deathworlders could hear any distress call, no matter how faint. But would they answer? No one could be sure. Would they even care? Or would they simply watch as another civilization fell? As the signal hummed through the console, Nari's heart pounded. The fate of her people rested on this single message. "Please," she whispered, as if speaking to the void. "Please hear us." For a long time, nothing happened. The XL Theory waited, their eyes fixed on the console. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The room was heavy with silence, each second bringing with it the weight of uncertainty. Nari felt a deep chill in her bones, and she could almost hear the shark ships closing in on them, like a predator circling its prey. But just as hope began to fade, a strange sound came from the console. It was faint at first, like a distant rumble. Then it grew louder, a low, deep hum that sent a shiver down Nari's spine. The signal was being received, but it was not just any response. The console began to flicker, and a garbled voice broke through the static. "We hear you. The Deathworlders come." The words were clear, but the tone was cold, almost emotionless. Nari could barely believe her ears. The Deathworlders had heard their call. They were coming. But what did that mean for her people? What would the Deathworlders do when they arrived? Would they save the Exalthuri, or would they demand something in return for their help? The Exalthuri Council looked at each other in stunned silence. They had sent their plea into the void, and now someone had responded. The question was, were they truly prepared for what was coming? Nari turned to face the council, her expression hardening with determination. The Deathworlders were coming, and her people would either survive or fall. There was no turning back now. The arrival of the Deathworlders. The Exalthuri Council stood in the Grand Hall, still in shock. The strange words from the Deathworlder fleet echoed in Nari's mind, leaving her with a mix of hope and dread. The message had been clear, but what would their arrival mean for the Exalthuri? The Deathworlders didn't answer calls out of kindness, at least, not according to the stories. There was always a price. The first few hours after the transmission had been received were filled with uncertainty. The Exalthuri's high-tech scanners were locked onto the skies, watching for any sign of the Deathworlder ships. But even their advanced technology could not predict what was coming. The sky above was quiet, as it had been for centuries. But in the pit of Nari's stomach, she could feel it, the unease that came with the unknown. And then, as the sun set behind the great floating cities of the Exalthuri homeworld, the first signs appeared. The scanners flickered to life. It was faint at first, just a glimmer in the vast blackness of space. But then it grew brighter, moving closer, until it filled the skies like a second sun. The massive fleet of the Deathworlders was descending upon their world. The sight was nothing like that Exalthuri had ever seen. The ships were enormous, black, jagged forms that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. They cut through space like predators hunting their prey. There were no glowing lights or colorful beacons. Instead, the Deathworlder ships were dark, intimidating, with sharp edges that made them look like weapons of destruction. Nari's heart pounded in her chest as she stood on the balcony of the council hall, staring out at the terrifying sight. She had called them for help, but now that they were here, she wasn't sure what to expect. Would they save them, or would they simply conquer and destroy? The fleet didn't land in the cities or near the planet's surface. Instead, they hovered just outside the atmosphere, their ominous presence filling the skies. The Exalthuri ground forces were ready, but the Deathworlders didn't give any sign of landing or communicating directly. Instead, they seemed to be waiting. The council had no choice but to wait as well. Nari's hands trembled slightly as she walked down to the command room, her mind racing. She had done everything she could, but now the fate of her people was in the hands of these mysterious warriors. She turned to her advisors, their faces just as uncertain as hers. "What are they waiting for?" One of the older council members, Syl, asked quietly. His voice held a mixture of fear and awe. He had lived through countless political struggles, but this was something else entirely. "I don't know," Nari replied, her voice steady but filled with doubt. "But we need to be ready for whatever comes next." Suddenly, the silence was broken. The communication system buzzed to life with a sharp mechanical voice. "Prepare for our arrival," the voice commanded, cold and emotionless. "We come to fight." The words sent a chill down the spines of everyone in the room. It wasn't a negotiation, a warning, or even an offer of help. It was an order. The Deathworlders were here for one thing: war. Nari's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. The Exalthuri had never faced a force like this before. Their armies were strong, their cities impenetrable, but they had no idea how to fight against such brutality. And now, the Deathworlders were here, not as saviors, but as warriors. They were coming to fight the Zarks. Yes, but would they do it on their own terms? The tension grew as the fleet began to descend even further, their ships filling the sky. The ground trembled beneath the council hall as the massive ships made their descent. It was as though the very atmosphere was bowing to their might. The Deathworlders had arrived. Neri turned to face her council. There was no turning back now. The only question left was whether or not her people would survive. The first clash. The air was thick with anticipation as the Thought-provoking forces assembled in the massive command center, looking out across the city toward the hovering fleet of the Deathworlders. The gigantic ships, their dark forms casting ominous shadows over the land, slowly descended closer to the surface. The stillness in the air was deafening, a calm before the storm. Neri's hands clenched into fists as she looked at the monitors, seeing the display of the Deathworlder fleet's size and sheer power. Every movement in the sky seemed to make her heart race faster. The fleet of enormous, jagged ships finally broke through the cloud cover, their dark silhouettes stark against the fading light of the day. The Thought-provoking soldiers on the ground stood at attention, ready for the unknown, while the rest of the council waited anxiously, whispering amongst themselves. They had no idea what to expect, but they all knew this was the moment that would determine the fate of their people. Neri's eyes flicked to the nearby communication panel, where the message from the Deathworlders had been replayed. "Prepare for our arrival. We come to fight." The words rang in her mind as the ground beneath her feet seemed to vibrate with the force of the descending ships. The Deathworlders weren't here to negotiate. They were here for action. Suddenly, without warning, one of the smaller ships in the fleet began to descend more quickly than the others, its engines roaring as it cut through the air with a deafening sound. The Thought-provoking soldiers braced themselves, weapons raised, ready to fire. But they didn't need to. The Deathworlder ship landed with a thunderous crash, sending a shockwave through the ground. It was as if the entire planet itself had been rattled by the impact. The dust and debris that followed momentarily obscured everything. But as it settled, a ramp lowered from the ship, revealing the first of the Deathworlders. The soldiers that emerged were massive, taller and broader than any of the Thought-provoking, their bodies covered in dark armor that gleamed menacingly in the fading light. Their eyes, fierce and cold, scanned the surroundings with a sense of quiet intensity. They didn't need to speak. Their very presence was enough to send a wave of fear through the ranks of the Thought-provoking forces. Neri could barely breathe. The Deathworlders were terrifying, and their reputation for brutality preceded them. But what truly unsettled her was their silence. They didn't speak, didn't make any grand statements. They simply began to move with purpose, organizing their forces without wasting a single moment. It was as if they had been waiting for this moment for a long time. The Thought-provoking commanders exchanged uncertain glances, trying to come to terms with the sudden realization that they had no control over the situation. The Deathworlders were taking charge, as if they had always intended to. The suddenness of it all left the council paralyzed. "Is this it?" whispered Sil, his voice shaking with fear. "Are they going to attack now?" Neri's mind raced. She had hoped for a clear strategy, a clear purpose behind the Deathworlders' arrival, but all she saw was an intimidating display of power. If they were going to fight, the Thought-provoking had no chance. As she stood there, lost in thought, the silence was shattered by a roar. A massive explosion erupted to the north, near one of the Thought-provoking military camps. It seemed the Deathworlders were already in action. Neri's eyes widened as the ground shook once again. From the distance, she saw the Thought-provoking soldiers scrambling to respond, but they were no match for the ruthless force that the Deathworlders had brought with them. The Deathworlders' weapons fired in quick succession, sending blasts of energy across the battlefield, cutting down anything that dared to stand in their way. Their technology was advanced, lethal, and ruthless. The air grew thick with the smell of burning metal and the sounds of chaos. Neri's stomach twisted as she realized the Deathworlders were not holding back. This was a full-scale battle, and the Thought-provoking were being overwhelmed. They had never seen anything like it before. The Deathworlders were not just coming to help. They were reshaping the battlefield on their own terms, with brutal efficiency. "They're too powerful," Neri muttered, her voice barely audible over the noise. "They're tearing us apart." Her heart sank as she watched more Deathworlder ships land, their troops pouring out with a precision that was almost surgical. They didn't seem interested in negotiation or diplomacy. The HFY were left in the wake of destruction, unable to retaliate in any meaningful way. But then, something unexpected happened. As Neri watched, she saw the Deathworlders start to push forward, toward the heart of the HFY city, where the Zharks had set up their most powerful weapons. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, Neri felt a shift. The Deathworlders weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting to bring an end to the reign of terror that had plagued their people for so long. And with each passing moment, the HFY were beginning to realize that this wasn't just their battle. It was a battle for all of them. As the explosions continued to light up the sky, Neri knew that everything was about to change. The Deathworlders had arrived, and they were ready to fight for victory. But more than that, they were ready to fight for the future. The war had only just begun. The unstoppable force. The sky above the battlefield burned with the fiery exchange between the Deathworlder fleet and the Zhark ships. Massive energy blasts streaked across the heavens, leaving trails of destruction in their wake. The ground trembled beneath the feet of the soldiers as the Deathworlders pressed forward with relentless force, their massive war machines charging against the overwhelming Zhark's forces. Neri, still hidden behind the shattered remnants of a ruined building, could hardly believe her eyes. The HFY had been caught in the crossfire, but the real threat was the Zharks, an ancient species that had once ruled the stars with terror. The HFY were now fighting side by side with the Deathworlders, and yet they were still struggling to comprehend the full scale of what was happening. Neri's heart raced as she watched the battle unfold. The Deathworlders, with their unyielding spirit, their advanced technology, and their brutal tactics, were not just holding their own. They were overpowering the Zharks. But the Zharks were relentless. Their ships loomed in the sky like shadows, as though nothing could stand against their might. The air was thick with tension, and every blast seemed to send shockwaves of fear through Neri's body. The Zharks were monsters. Their ships were enormous, their weapons deadly. Yet the Deathworlders fought on, their strength unbroken, their resolve unshaken. There was something in their eyes, something that told Neri that they would not rest until the Zharks were defeated. "Sil, do you think we can win?" Neri asked, her voice trembling as she watched the chaos around them. Sil stood beside her, his face a mix of awe and fear. His hand gripped the communicator at his belt, but it seemed as if even the advanced technology couldn't bring him the answers he was searching for. "I don't know," he replied quietly, "but I know one thing. The Deathworlders never back down. They'll fight until every last Zharks is wiped from this galaxy." Neri turned her eyes back to the battle. The Deathworlder forces were everywhere, charging forward with such precision that it was hard to believe they were fighting against such a powerful foe. Each movement seemed deliberate, every strike calculated. And yet, despite their relentless assault, the Zharks were not faltering. They were dangerous, adaptable, and above all, merciless. The HFY forces, though still in shock, were beginning to find their footing. They moved alongside the Deathworlders, their weapons joining the onslaught, but they were still not quite used to the chaos of the war. For centuries, they had been on the defensive, their civilization constantly threatened by invaders. Now, they were in the middle of an all-out battle for their very survival. But the Deathworlders did not hesitate. Neri had seen it in their eyes. Their will was indomitable. Even when their own forces were nearly overwhelmed, they fought on. They were the guardians of the galaxy now, and they would not allow the Zharks to reign again. Neri felt a chill run down her spine as a particularly massive Zhark ship descended from the clouds, its dark hull casting a shadow over the battlefield. It was the flagship of their fleet, its cannons bristling with energy. The Deathworlders had anticipated this, though, and they had a plan. Their ships reoriented, charging directly toward the flagship with fierce determination. "Now," Sil shouted, "they're going after the flagship. This is it." The air crackled with energy as the Deathworlder fleet launched their final desperate assault. The ground shuddered as the first volley of laser fire struck the Zark's ship. The death toll was mounting on both sides, and Neri felt the weight of every blast reverberate in her chest. The Deathworlders, though they seemed to be fighting against impossible odds, had one advantage: their resolve. She saw them now, one Deathworlder after another charging across the battlefield, no hesitation in their steps. Each one of them was like a force of nature, unstoppable in their quest to destroy the Zarks. Their warriors, their soldiers, their fleet, all of them embodied a strength and purpose that no enemy could ever hope to match. The Zark's flagship fired back, releasing a massive blast that sent shockwaves across the battlefield. The Deathworlder ships dodged and retaliated, unleashing an overwhelming barrage of firepower. Neri watched in awe as the sky lit up in a dazzling array of explosions, some of which took down entire Zark ships in a single strike. But the flagship was still standing. It was massive, and it had the firepower to obliterate anything in its path. As it prepared to launch another devastating attack, Neri held her breath. If this wasn't stopped, it could destroy the entire city. In a split second, a small group of Deathworlder ships swooped down from above, firing a concentrated beam directly at the flagship's core. The explosion was deafening. A brilliant flash of light engulfed the Zark ship, and for a moment, Neri thought it might be over. Then, the darkness came. The Zark's flagship had exploded into pieces, a massive shockwave pushing the remaining Zark ships into retreat. The Deathworlders had done it. The mighty force that had threatened to wipe out civilizations was now defeated. But the war was not over. The Deathworlders knew better than anyone that there were always more threats lurking in the shadows. The victory here was monumental, but it was only one battle in a much larger war, and they would be ready for whatever came next. Neri exhaled slowly, her heart still racing. The Deathworlders had saved them. They had done what no one else could. And the galaxy, for the first time in generations, had a glimmer of hope. The price of victory. The echoes of the battle still rang in the air, but the victory was theirs. The Deathworlders had successfully pushed the Zark's fleet into retreat. The sky, once filled with chaos, now stood eerily silent, with only the occasional flare of a distant explosion as remnants of the enemy's forces attempted to regroup. Neri stood amidst the ruins of the battlefield, her mind still racing. The sheer scale of what had just happened was almost too much to comprehend. The Deathworlders, relentless and powerful, had once again proven that no force in the galaxy could stand against them. But victory had come at a great cost. Around her, the city lay in shambles. Buildings were reduced to rubble, and the streets were littered with the bodies of both fallen warriors and civilians. The cries of the wounded could be heard in every corner, and the air smelled of smoke and scorched earth. The victory they had won was hard-earned, but it was clear. The Deathworlders had paid a heavy price. Neri's gaze fell on Syl, who stood nearby, a look of quiet determination on his face. His armor was scorched and battered, evidence of the fierce fighting they had endured. Yet he remained standing, ever resolute. "Syl," she said softly, her voice shaking with emotion. "We did it, but at what cost?" He turned to her, his face solemn. "We did what we had to do. The Deathworlders always do. But the price of victory is not something we can ignore. There are too many lives lost, too many worlds shattered." As Neri looked around, she saw the weight of his words reflected in the faces of those around her. The survivors, both Seltheri and Deathworlders, were tending to the wounded, searching for any survivors amidst the devastation. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. "There will be more battles," Neri said quietly, "and more sacrifices. How many more worlds will fall before this is over?" Syl's eyes darkened, but there was no fear in his gaze. "We don't know, but we will fight until the last breath. The Zarks may have been defeated today, but there are always new threats, And as long as we stand, as long as the Deathworlders are here, we will protect those who cannot protect themselves." The words hit Neri harder than she expected. She had always known the Deathworlders were warriors, but to hear Xil speak with such conviction, such unwavering resolve, it was a reminder of the harsh reality they lived in. The galaxy was vast, and threats were endless. But there was something about the Deathworlders that made them unique. Their resilience, their indomitable will to fight for others, even at the cost of their own lives. This was why they had been chosen to be the protectors of the galaxy. As Neri looked around once more, she saw the Deathworlders moving with purpose, organizing the recovery efforts, aiding the injured, and preparing for whatever came next. Their strength was unmatched, and yet they knew that this was only one battle in an ongoing war. The galaxy was far from safe, and every victory came with its own price. But one thing was clear: the Deathworlders would never back down. They had already proven that. "We need to regroup," Xil said, his voice firm. "The Deathworlder fleet will be making contact soon. We'll need to prepare for any further attacks. This won't be the last time the Zarks or any other enemy comes after us." Neri nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. The fight was far from over, and the Deathworlders knew that they would face even greater challenges in the days to come. But there was something unshakable about their presence. No matter how many enemies stood in their way, the Deathworlders would always rise to meet them. As the survivors began to rebuild, the sky above them grew darker, clouds gathering in the distance. It was a sign of more storms to come. But for now, the Deathworlders stood tall, and their presence was enough to push back the darkness. Neri, standing side by side with Xil and the others, felt a sense of strength welling up inside her. The galaxy had been saved, for now, but the cost of victory had been steep, and they would never forget the sacrifices that had been made. They would carry the weight of those sacrifices with them, knowing that their fight was far from over. But as long as the Deathworlders were there was always hope. The final stand. A new dawn. The weight of the past battles lingered in the air as the Deathworlders prepared for what was to come. The world had been saved from one enemy, but others were lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The Deathworlders knew this. They had been through countless wars, facing threats that no one else could even begin to comprehend. But this time felt different. The stakes were higher, and the cost of failure was more dire than ever before. Neri stood alongside Xil on the highest point of the city, gazing out at the horizon. The first light of dawn was breaking through the clouds, casting a pale glow over the ruined landscape. Despite the destruction, there was a sense of hope in the air. The Deathworlders had done what they always did, protected the helpless, and defeated the forces of tyranny. But the war was far from over. "They'll come for us again," Neri said, her voice heavy with realization. "We know the Zarks aren't the only threat. This galaxy is full of enemies, and they won't rest until they've wiped us out." Xil looked at her, his face resolute. "Yes, but we've been fighting for a long time. And no one fights harder than the Deathworlders. We'll keep protecting the helpless, no matter the cost." Neri took a deep breath, trying to steady the whirlwind of thoughts in her mind. She had seen the Deathworlders in action. They were unmatched in strength, tenacity, and skill. But even they had their limits, and she had to wonder, how many more times could they risk everything to save those who were too weak to defend themselves? Suddenly, the silence was broken by the hum of a distant signal, a familiar sound, one that Neri had learned to recognize. It was a call, a distress signal, not from the Teltheri world, but from somewhere deep within the galaxy. "It's happening again," Xil muttered, his expression darkening. "Another world in need of our help." Neri's heart sank. She knew the call could mean only one thing. Another war was on the horizon, and the Deathworlders would be called to action once more. But this time, the stakes felt higher. After everything they had endured, after all the lives lost and battles fought, could they truly handle more? Without another word, they turned and began making their way toward the command center. The Deathworlders were ready to respond, but this time, Nari could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had seen the cost of their victories, and now she wondered if the price would be too high. As they entered the command center, the room buzzed with activity. Officers were gathering data, analyzing the distress signal, and coordinating the next steps. The air was thick with tension as the Deathworlders prepared to mobilize once again. Sale stood tall, a figure of unshakable resolve, and addressed the room. "We've fought countless battles, and we've always emerged victorious. But this time, we will need every warrior, every ship, every resource we have. There's no room for failure." The room fell silent. The Deathworlders understood what this meant. It wasn't just a battle. It was a stand, an all-out war for the survival of the galaxy. The enemy they faced this time wasn't just a threat to one world. It was a threat to all of them. Nari could feel the weight of Syl's words. There was no turning back now. The Deathworlders would answer the call once again, but this time, they would have to be ready for everything. "We won't stop until we win," Syl continued, his voice firm, every word resonating with the strength of their collective will. "We fight because we must. We fight because it's our duty. And we fight because we are the last line of defense for the galaxy. We will stand together, Deathworlders united, stronger than ever." The room erupted in a chorus of agreement. The Deathworlders were ready. They would fight with everything they had, even if it meant sacrificing everything. Their mission was clear. No matter what, they would protect the innocent, no matter the cost. Nari glanced out the window, her thoughts heavy. The galaxy was vast, and the enemies they faced were numerous. But the Deathworlders were not afraid. They had always stood firm, and they always would. No force in the universe could extinguish the fire that burned within them. As the Deathworlder fleet prepared for departure, Nari knew one thing for certain. The galaxy was far from safe, but as long as the Deathworlders stood at the front lines, hope remained. They would fight. They would win. And they would continue to answer the call, no matter the cost. And in that moment, Nari knew that the Deathworlders were not just warriors. They were the last, unyielding hope of the galaxy. They were the ones who would never back down, never surrender, and never stop fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves.